Thank you very much for the kind invitation to be here, to POLIN and to the university, and Izabela for bringing me here. It's a great honor, and thank you for coming out on this cold and rainy night. I thought I was coming to summertime in Warsaw, but maybe I was wrong. Therefore, my jacket, so excuse me for that. I am very delighted to be part of this series on the challenges that the humanities are facing, which is also a discussion that we're having in the United States. And I hope that by the end of my talk, you'll be convinced of the relationship between the example of how using the humanities and the social scientists can help us understand the role that social institutions can play, but also by doing that, also enhances and clarifies what role the humanities can play in social problem solving. Because I very much believe that we're not going to right economic and political wrongs until we right cultural wrongs as well. So my book project comes out of my work for many years as a scholar of migration. And we live in a world on the move. 1 out of every 7 people in the world today is either an international or an internal migrant who moves by force or by choice, with great success or with great struggle. And whether I was studying people who were from Pakistan or from India or from Brazil or from Ireland or from the Caribbean who came to the United States, they were always connected in some way back to their homelands. They were involved in economic activities, they were involved in politics, they were following a religious leader who were back home, and so they lived transnational lives, but the social contract between the citizen and state was always nationally bounded. So by that I mean that the pension system and the healthcare system and the legal system stayed within the boundaries of the nation state, but people's lives did not. And so I began to ask myself, where would we be able to have a different kind of conversation? Where would the cultural building blocks come from to have a different kind of conversation about a different kind of nation that didn't necessarily stop at national borders? And where would we get the materials to have that conversation, but also to create different kinds of institutions in response? And that's where museums come in, because museums in the past have been very influential in creating national citizens and creating nations. And so I asked myself, to what extent are museums today in this global world, in this world on the move, also helping us to create global citizens? And in what combinations? So are they doing the local and the city and the national and the global at the same time? And in what combinations and why? So in other words, what do I learn about the city by looking, how does a city help, how do particular cities and their histories and their cultural past help explain the findings that I discovered? And what do I learn about nationalism by looking at a country's cultural institutions? Okay, so to answer these questions, I visited a variety of museums around the world. I wasn't just looking at ethnographic museums or history museums or cultural heritage museums, but all of these different museums, art museums, because I think that each of them gives us a window into how the nation is portrayed. And what I ended up doing was having three sets of museums. So 2 countries that were each at a different stage of their nation building and their kind of world claiming project. So I've studied museums in Gothenburg and Stockholm and Copenhagen. So Sweden and Denmark, that are kind of countries that are over empire, that are, long past their aspirations for claiming to be the world's superpower. Then I studied museums in Boston and New York that some would say is a country that's still at the height of its empire, and some would say is beginning to be well on the way down. And then I studied museums in Singapore and Doha. So 2 countries that are using museums, that are both new countries using cultural institutions to help build their nations. And I was also interested in those cases whether there was a different kind of version of global citizenship being articulated. So was there a Muslim version of global citizenship, or was there an Arab version of global citizenship that I would find? So I want to say that this is not an evaluation study. So I wasn't able to evaluate how visitors to museums, what messages they actually took away. What I'm going to talk to you about tonight is what the curators and educators and museum directors and the professional staff think that they're doing. And so I really want to stress that I can't tell you what visitors take away, but this is what people think that they're going on, what they think is going on. And I also want to say that a little bit about cosmopolitanism or global citizenship before I get any further. So for me, the idea of global citizenship or cosmopolitanism was an empirical question. So it wasn't a done deal, or it wasn't a fact that some of these professionals thought that they were creating global citizens with their work, and what would that actually mean? So part of my work was to ask people, do you feel like you're creating global citizens with your work? And if so, what does that mean to you? And it turned out that cosmopolitanism had kind of 3 parts. One is ideas and practice. One is ideas and values. The second is the practices and skills that you need to engage in a cosmopolitan relationship. And the third is cosmopolitics. So an actual political project that would create a cosmopolitan world. And what would we need to do to be able to get there? So what did I hear from people? The people who did feel like this was part of their work talked about things like creativity, critical thinking, curiosity, listening, tolerance, reflexivity. I'm sure a lot of the things that this museum feels that it's hoping that its visitors will take away. A willingness to engage with different people and different experiences. And then sometimes things like human rights or gender equality or democracy came into the conversation, but that was clearly more problematic in places like Singapore or in Doha. And so at the end of the day, at the end of my project, I came to think about cosmopolitanism as a kind of willingness and an understanding of the importance of engaging in a conversation with people that are different than you, this willingness and skills to engage in that conversation, and then about what that common ground might be. So in other words, not assuming what the common ground is without the discussion, but the willingness and the skills to engage in that conversation. And it turned out that museums who thought that they were contributing to cosmopolitanism through their work often were doing the ideas and the skill building part of it, but there were very few that actually were giving a plan for a cosmopolitan project. Okay, so let me say a little bit about the history of museums and their role in creating nations and creating global citizens. So as many of you might know, some of the world's great museums came of age at the same time as the nations where they're located were coming into existence. So, for example, the Louvre was one of the first collections that was opened to the French public after the French Revolution. And this was so that people could come into a place and see things objects and values and traditions that were on display and kind of recognized them as something that was familiar, something that they embraced. And so complete strangers would feel part of the nation. So in this way, museums were part of the nation-building project. But this was never an egalitarian project because the way things get put on display, both what's on display, how it was collected, and we know that many of these materials were brought back from former colonies that were looted and stolen and taken by force. And then the way that they are ordered and organized in relation to each other, both spatially and then the way they are explained, give clear messages about what the museum prioritizes and what kind of knowledge is prioritized and what the message is that the exhibit is trying to explain. So visitors come ready to be exposed to a particular kind of truth that's based on a certain kind of set of values, and that is that things are simple, truths are simple and factual and real. And even though we're told that all the things in a particular room are of equal value, the way that the light directs us, or the way that objects are organized in relation to each other, when something's in the center, when something has a lot of light on it, when something's in the back of the room, when something's hardly visible, those choices are communicating to us rhetorics of value about what's important and what's not important, what we need to pay attention to and what we can ignore, what gets silenced and what gets really talked about. And this is true not just with the galleries of what's inside the galleries, but also how what museum professionals often talk about as the real estate, the distribution of the real estate in museums get divided up. So, for example, when I was talking with Kim Benzel, who's a curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, she said, if you come here into the Met just cold, you come in and there's a fabulously grand spread of Greek and Roman to your left and an enormous spread of vast and grand Egyptian to your right, and then up the stairs are the European paintings. Since time immemorial, this has been the holy of the holies of many Western institutions. You have to really look if you want to find Africa or Latin America. So maybe some of you can think about museums that you have visited, and you'll remember sort of walking up these grand staircases, and then you go into a kind of grand entrance hall, which feels like you're entering a temple of knowledge. So it's a kind of Western, superior, triumphant story about progress that's embedded in the bricks and mortar. And most of us come kind of socialized accepting these truths. In other words, we forget to remind ourselves that there's a curator who made these choices and that they're not God, they're a human being with opinions and biases. And so as a result, there are a lot of people who see museums as beyond salvation. They just say, for example, the anthropologist Hassan Haag says that they're just too flawed by these kinds of Western-centric assumptions and simplistic storylines. And whenever they try to do something different, they want so much credit that, it just doesn't make any sense. Another view dismisses these critiques as being too much political correctness. So, for example, James Cuno, who was the director of the Chicago Institute of Art for many years and now runs the Getty Foundation in California, says when he's asking readers in a recent book whether they experience museums in this way, kind of that you're being manipulated by curatorial choices and by the way you're directed to go through the space. He says, do you walk through the galleries of your local museum and feel controlled in any significant way? Do you feel manipulated by a higher power? He believes that museums still matter and that Enlightenment's principles still apply. So for people like Cuno, museums don't create citizens, be they national or global. They collect, classify, and present facts, calling into question unverified truths and opposing prejudice and superstition for the betterment of mankind. But then a third view says that museums can and must create citizens in the 21st century if they want to remain relevant. They know that they're still primarily the stomping grounds of people with money in their pockets and degrees on their walls, and they also recognize that museums have tremendous swaying power, even for people that never come in the door. So I think this museum is a great example of that. The fact that it's here, even though many Warszaws, I hope they do come, but those who don't come know that it's here, and that kind of changes their understanding of the cultural and political landscape. So many of the curators that I spoke with do feel that museums can and must encourage values like empathy and curiosity and tolerance and essence cosmopolitan competencies, and that will help people engage with a newcomer next door or with their relatives across the globe. So in other words, you can create cosmopolitans by getting people to understand that there's diversity within, or connecting that diversity within to diversity across the globe. Okay, so what explains where museums fall on this cosmopolitan nationalism continuum? So none of the museums that I studied told a completely national story or told a completely cosmopolitan story. So in other words, the nation was always somehow connected to the globe, and the global was always somehow viewed through a national frame. So I came to think about these as on a continuum. And so I'll present to you some of the museums that I visited today, and then try to explain to you why they fall where they fall on this range. And the differences, not surprisingly, have a lot to do with the individual institutions' histories and their collections and their curatorial expertise. So museums can only do what they can have in their storerooms, or they have what they're able to borrow and what their curators feel comfortable doing. They also have to do with whether they're privately or publicly funded. So, for example, museums in the United States are mostly privately funded, whereas in Europe, many museums are publicly funded, and they're kind of often tools that governments use to achieve social goals. It has to do with the scope, whether museums started out life as art museums or ethnographic museums, and then how they've evolved. And it also has to do with what I came to think of as museums' role in the institutional distribution of labor. So there is kind of an ecology of institutions in particular cities. So, and often one museum, like the City Museum or the Multicultural Community Center, gets designated the institution that's the most appropriate for doing diversity. And then the National Museum should tell the more shared national story. So, and it's hard to break out of this role because there's a kind of expectation that this distribution of labor will stay steady. But there are 3 points that I want to make that add to this list of what explains why museums do what they do. And the first has to do with the city's cultural armature. And by that I mean its deep history and the kind of values that its founding fathers, and they usually were fathers, laid down when they came to a particular place. So what were their ideas and values about things like inequality, about the responsibility of the individual to the collective and the collective to the individual, about how much poverty they would tolerate, and a big piece of this is what I think of as a city's or a nation's diversity management regime. So in other words, how does difference, if and how difference gets talked about? What kind of words are used to talk about difference? What kinds of data are collected to measure that difference, whether it's seen as a problem or an opportunity? And then what is done about it. So, for example, in the United States, I would say our diversity management regime includes the idea that you can be a hyphenated American. And by that, I mean, you can say, I'm an Italian American, I'm a Jewish American, I'm a Chinese American. And until recently, no one would question that your Italianness or your Irishness called into question the American side of the equation. You understand what I mean? So I can be, in a sense that some would claim that that's what being American is all about. Now, so when groups say relative newcomers, Filipino Americans or Indian Americans, claim that that's a way of taking their place at the American multicultural table. That's an empowering terminology. When I went to Sweden and Denmark, I realized that the exact same labels would be considered marginalizing and leading to social exclusion. So calling somebody, you're not going to hear many people saying, I'm a Pakistani Dane or an Iraqi Swede, because those kinds of words, those kinds of labels are seen as putting people in boxes and leading to social exclusion. And so the way diversity gets managed is also reflected in museum practice. In the United States, we have many museums that are about the experience of particular groups. In Scandinavia, you're not going to see those kinds of museums because it's counter to the diversity management regime. The second factor that I think helps explains where museums fall on the cosmopolitan nationalism continuum is this idea of where a country is in the global cultural hierarchy, and then how much it contributes to what I call a global museum assemblage, how much it contributes to and is influenced by that. So let me explain. Just like countries are ranked according to their economic and their political power, so countries are ranked culturally. And where a country is in terms of its cultural prominence or its cultural peripherality or peripheralness, it also influences how much it contributes to what I came to think of as this global museum assemblage, or a kind of package of ways of doing museum that I found all around the world. So that is how things get exhibited, how public programs work, how education works, the fact that we now expect to find a gourmet restaurant and a gift shop in the museums that we go to, the fact that we expect blockbuster exhibits, the fact that there are museum education programs proliferating around the world, like curatorial studies programs around the world. The fact that there are institutions of global governance that regulate museum practice, like the International Council on Museums. And also the transnational class of professionals that are both part of this assemblage or part of this package, but also are carrying the package with them each time that they go and work in another country. So I met people in Doha who had worked in Queens and Brooklyn and then carried their museum practice to Doha and will probably circulate either in the Gulf region or in the Asian region, or maybe if they're lucky enough, they'll circulate around the world. And each time they do, they're carrying this pieces of this assemblage in their portfolio, in their laptop, in their suitcase, and that's how this package gets disseminated around the world. So one explanation, one thing that helps us understand where museums are on this cosmopolitan nationalism continuum is how much a city or a country is contributing to that assemblage, but also influenced by it. And then finally, the final factor that I want to bring to light is where the country is in the arc of its nation building and empire building project. So as I said in the beginning of my talk, that Singapore and Doha are countries that are using museums to really take their place regionally, take a more prominent regional place, if not a more global place. So let me, in the time that I have left, take you very quickly to Sweden, and then to Boston, and then to Qatar. Okay, so Sweden, as some of you might know, is a country that experienced a lot of demographic diversity in the last 60 years. So it was a very homogenous place. It was a place that thought of itself as charting a third way, being a moral exemplar to the rest of the world. So Olof Palme was one of the first to talk about solidarity, not stopping at national borders. And so Sweden saw itself as a model to the rest of the world. That kind of changed in the 1990s, 1980s, when the economy started failing, when the welfare state started weakening. And Sweden was welcoming to varying degrees, sometimes very generously, sometimes not so generously, refugees and immigrants. So how was it going to come to terms with its new face? And so the Ministry of Culture created a group of 4 museums under one umbrella called the Museums of World Culture, the Museum of World Cultures, and there are 3 in Stockholm and 1 in Gothenburg. So this is an old ethnographic museum in Gothenburg that is called the Museum of World Cultures, and this is from an exhibit that was about Bollywood posters, and in another museum where that created this exhibit, these had been paired with information about Hinduism and Indianness. But in this exhibit, the museum really feels that creating global citizens is a good goal in and of itself, and that indirectly, once you have strong global citizens, that also creates a stronger nation. So here, these same materials were being used to say that that Westernization and globalization and Americanization are not the same thing, that there are multiple cores and multiple peripheries, and that we really need to understand these kind of multiple sites of cultural production, that they're not all the same or homogeneous. And then this was an exhibit called Destination X, which was about migration and what does it mean how does the color of your skin or the color of your passport affect your ability to move? And so these were articles that the public were asked to donate that they took with them when they traveled. So for example, a dress that a woman took when she went to adopt her daughter in Colombia, or the shoes that somebody wore when they were going on a pilgrimage. And so, and even in Stockholm, where the National Museum is telling a very national story, it tells a very different story than in Denmark. So, for example, the same prehistoric, pre-archaeological materials that are used in Denmark to say, yes, there was travel, yes, there was circulation, yes, there was trade, but this was Denmark 14,000 years ago, and we should be proud of those roots in Denmark today. Those same kind of materials in Sweden were used to say, 14,000 years ago, there was no such thing as Sweden. This is the nation is a creation, and it's a fluid social construct. And in fact, many histories have been left out. And so, for example, they use different special exhibits to flesh out that story. And this was from a side exhibit that was about LGBTQ history in Sweden. So what I want to just leave you with here is that Sweden, the museums in Sweden in general, tell a very global story because the government feels that it's important for Swedes to feel a sense of responsibility towards global problems, even if they do it in a Swedish way. But this is also this embrace of the global is also a rejection of the national. So if you focus on the global, you don't have to deal so much with your own national history. And so I think it's a kind of way, it's also a way for Swedes in their museums to not have to deal with parts of their history that they don't really want to come to grips with, like eugenics experiments or their role during World War II or their treatment of the Sami. So an embrace of the global, but a rejection of the national. The Sami, the indigenous community? Okay. Now I'm going to take you quickly to Boston, where the Museum of Fine Arts added a new wing in 2010. And so this is a museum, when I talk about the national distribution of labor, this is a museum where people come to understand colonial New England. And many of the donors and many of the benefactors who contributed materials to this museum had these stellar collections of material culture from the New England experience. And so it's very hard for them to depart from that experience, particularly because they're dependent upon visitor fees for most of their budget. But they did build this new wing, and it's called the Art of the Americas wing. And the idea was to tell a very different story about what's American art. And the punchline of this story, or the takeaway point of this story, was that American art was never just made in the USA. And the idea is that you can walk in on any of the 4 floors of this new wing and be able to see that story. So, for example, these are on the basement. They are from Guatemala from 750 AD. They're Quiche burial urns. And so you walk into the start of the exhibit in the basement, and the message is that the foundation of American art was indigenous cultural production, whether it's from North America, from Central America, from South America. Okay? And then we go up to the second floor, which is about the Revolutionary War period, and this is allegedly one of the 3 most iconic objects. It's the Liberty Bowl that was created by Paul Revere, a famous silversmith from Boston, who and it's supposed to be a very nationalistic object, but it turns out that nothing that would have been created at that time everything would have been Chinese influence. So in other words, the China trade and the East Asia trade was so influential in that region at that point that this is actually modeled after a Chinese punch bowl. Thank you. And this is a picture of Paul Revere, a painting of Paul Revere. And here again, he's holding this teapot that is also very Chinese influenced. Another way that the museum is telling a different story is through what they call adjacencies. So as I said, this museum is very well known for its New England, its English colonial experience. But there was a Spanish colonial experience going on in another part of the continent at this time. And so it was a big step forward for the museum to say, look, we also have materials on display from the Spanish colonies, but they're not in the same room, they're adjacent to each other. And so the visitor is supposed to understand the commonalities between these different colonial experiences, even though they took place in different parts of the country. So this is a portrait of Timothy Matlock, a lawyer from Philadelphia, and he's sitting very regally. He's very powerful. He has authority as expressed by his body language and by the way he's dressed and by the seat that he's sitting in. And there is the Archbishop of Mexico, who is also very regally dressed and an authoritarian figure. And so one is supposed to understand that whether it's through communion wafers and crucifixes or legal books and legislation, that the colonial experience had a lot in common, even though it was geographically far apart. So what we see here is What we see here is, what we learn is that the American art was never just made in America, and we learn a lot about what that means for looking into the country, that it was connected to Latin America, that it was connected to Europe, that it was connected to Asia. But we don't hear a lot about what that means for looking out and what that might mean for how we might reconsider the country's position or the country's role in the world. And I think here again, it's another example of the kind of discourse about globalization and the country's understanding of itself and its position in the world. So when you think of yourself as the center of the world, as the world's superpower, you think that the world should come to you and that you don't have to go to the rest of the world to learn languages or understand other people or go outside to learn. And that's kind of narcissism and hubris is also reflected in museum practice to varying degrees throughout the United States. And so the last place I want to take you to is Doha. And this is a picture. Doha is a fairly new country. I'm using Doha and Qatar interchangeably because so much of life is focused on the capital city in Qatar. But Qatar is a relatively new country, 60 years old. This is a picture of Doha Bay in the 1980s when the first Sheraton Hotel was being built. And this is a picture of the Doha skyline today. So this is a country that's undergone tremendous economic and political change. And it's a country where citizenship means everything and it means nothing, because 12% of the population is actually a citizen, and those people get access to housing and $87,000 a year and free education. And then the rest of the people who live in Qatar are the people who are designing and building these buildings and the museums and the universities that are all part of a strategic plan to change Qatar over to a knowledge economy, but also to reposition it within the region and within the rest of the world. And so everything in Qatar, and so we have those museum professionals or the university professors that I talked about as part of this mobile class. But we also have, as you know, many workers who are working under deplorable conditions, building these buildings or driving the taxis or taking care of the children of these more wealthy residents. And so everything in Qatar has a dual function. So an outward-looking message and an inward-looking message. A message for the Qatari population and a message to the rest of the world. So whether we're talking about Qatar Airways or Al Jazeera in English, or the universities, it's called Education City, which is a place where there are 8 U.S. universities and I think a university from France and the UK that have this kind of programs, international programs that people can come to under a kind of alleged free speech zone, or whether it's the 12 to 16 museums that were on the docket when I was doing my museum research. All of this is to say to the world, this is a place that matters, this is a place with power, this is a place with influence, and this is a place worth visiting, and you should come. And also to Qatari citizens, you should feel proud of your history, even if it's a history that's being invented because there wasn't a lot, people didn't collect things because they were moving, and there wasn't a lot of written culture. And so the part of that's particularly interesting about Qatar is that the history is being written with the help of this transnational professional class that's been invited in to say what it is. So what would citizenship mean here, and what would the kind of cosmopolitan values be that might be being embraced? Well, there was a lot of discussion about things like curiosity and critical thinking and engagement and questioning and being comfortable with some kinds of difference, but certainly the idea about equality for women or workers' protections was not on the docket. So we're not going to see exhibits about human trafficking or climate change like we saw in Sweden. What we will see are exhibits about camel racing and falconry and dhows, which are the boats, traditional boats that are used for fishing and trade. We'll see exhibits about women athletes, so sometimes wearing Western athletic wear, sometimes wearing burkinis, which are considered appropriate swimwear for observant Muslims. Or we'll see tea with Nefertiti, which is a critique of, and I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, which is a critique of how Egyptian materials have been treated in the past. So there are actually three museums that are actually open now. The first is the Museum of Islamic Art, which was created by one of these starchitects that also are responsible for designing many of the museums around the world. And this is by I.M. Pei. Inside is this beautiful atrium, kind of the equivalent of that entrance hall that I was talking about, that you come in and you feel this sense of awe and inspiration. And then these are materials that were purchased mostly by the royal family to kind of say, we are a country that can have a stellar Islamic art collection with in a stellar building, and we can take our place among other cities around the world that have stellar buildings as well, like Bilbao with the Guggenheim Museum. The next museum is Mataf, which is the Arab Museum of Modern Art. And this is just as that the Museum of Islamic Art says we can be in the stellar Islamic Art Museum game. This is the museum that says we can be in the contemporary art world. We know how to do edgy, we know how to do Sharjah Biennial, and we, as one curator put it to me, if you want to play in the global art world, you have to be able to do global art speak. So this is the exhibit from Tea with Nefertiti, and this is a sarcophagus, but it's made out of Tupperware. So it's kind of a tongue-in-cheek kind of experience. And then this is the National Museum. I'm not sure if it's actually opened or still to be open, designed by another star architect, Jean Nouvel. And this is the particularly challenging project because what is the story that the nation's going to tell, and how is it going to be told, and for whom? So let me just conclude by saying that a world on the move produces opportunities and anxieties, more wealth and much more inequality, a decentering of power into more centers where power gets concentrated anew. New social safety nets are needed, which protect and provide for individuals outside the traditional nation-state framework, and different kinds of health and education and social welfare institutions that respond more effectively to people's mobile lives. It's no surprise that countries around the world are grappling with how to create citizens who can live successfully in diverse neighborhoods and who actively engage with the world at the same time. The many professionals and policymakers that I wrote about in my book shed light on how museums drive forward these dynamics and respond to them. In fact, my book includes two stories that, although in tension, have to be said at the same time. It's about the role museums play in creating citizens, the project of crafting cosmopolitan values, competencies, and projects among people who feel part of nations and regions and cities and towns. At the same time, it tells the story of how global cultural production and consumption, as seen through the prism of the art world, influence and are influenced by these processes on the ground. Now, I know there were many people who were struggling with how museums can change, and museums are not the most agile institutions. If you want to really make quick change, big quick change, I wouldn't turn to museums necessarily. But I think that museums realize that more and more there's a kind of worldwide understanding that the people who are inside museums don't look enough like the people who are outside museums. And there have been many studies recently in the United States that show that the way the demographics of the country is changing is not keeping pace with the people who are visiting museums or running museums or designing museums. And that if museums want to stay open and want to stay viable, something really needs to change. And so I think that we're at a current moment where either there are visionary leaders or there are not so visionary leaders who are kind of being pushed by demographic realities to pursue something that doesn't look like business as usual. And I'm excited to see that how that unfolds. So thank you very much for your attention.
Barbara, you are a member of this transnational social class of professionals who brought the global ideas to Poland and who is the mediator of the global vision of the museum, where we are in tonight with the local conditions you encountered here in Poland. What are your experiences? How would you react to this assumption of Peggy that professionals like you, who are curators of the museum, create global citizens?
I'm so glad you asked a question, and it's a very good question. Well, first of all, let me just say that I really appreciated Peggy's book very much. It's a beautifully written book, and it's a wonderful read. Very accessible, very thoughtful, and very interesting in the way that it's constructed, because it's quite complicated to deal with these concepts and to deal with them in more or less three major different locations in several different museums. So it's in that way, I think it's really a tour de force, and I want to thank Peggy very much for what she's offered. Also, it's a very special book in the sense that Peggy's coming to it as a sociologist interested in migration and in transnational flows. And that isn't, although those concerns are there in the literature, generally speaking, they're not the primary frame for looking at museums. And that way, I think also that it's a very important contribution. So, I have a lot of thoughts. One is, I think maybe it is either expecting or crediting museums too much to think that they, quote, create global citizens. So that would be my first point, is that to expect that museums would, quote, create global citizens, and to argue that they aspire to or that they do, I think is, honestly, I think it's going too far. That's how I'd put it. I think it's there in the discourse, and it's certainly there in the work of Tony Bennett, the new museology. It's kind of a recurrent, I would say it's a recurrent theme. It's there in the 19th century with Goody and these other thinkers, but I would probably step back from it a bit. But at the same time, and I know it from this museum in particular, that there is a strong interest here in what's called citizen education. And I think it has to do with this being a post-communist society, a young democracy, and in a world that has moved more and more to the right. So the idea of something called citizen education is which is not the same thing as creating a citizen, but citizen education. Now, in this particular case, it's quite tricky because the history of Polish Jews, the history of European Jews, has been, I would say, the way in which it's understood and the way in which our visitors come to think about it, it's very much overdetermined by the Holocaust. And what that means is that genocide comes to define what happens when, if you will, a notion of citizenship in the way that Peggy's talked about it is completely defeated. When it doesn't. So what happens, my problem is that when the Holocaust becomes the, I would say, the poster child for trying to communicate tolerance, citizenship, all those good things, then the history of Polish Jews gets reduced to a lesson in intolerance. And so I have a kind of a problematic relationship to citizen education, tolerance, global museums as creating a certain kind of citizen, global, cosmopolitan, whatever. It's for me not, how can I say, there's a kind of utopian, I do believe actually that museums are quite utopian, actually. But I'm just not so ready to go there. Let me put it that way. Maybe.
Do you want to react on that?
Yeah, if I can, please.
I had another question for you, but please continue the discussion. Please. Short comment.
I think what's interesting, following your line of thinking, is that what I think that the POLIN Museum actually does as the main thing, empowering citizenship, is the feeling of responsibility for everything that was learned here. And apart from the fact that obviously the genocide gives a very specific perspective over the topic, the very general take-home message, is that everyone is responsible for whatever they've seen here and they've experienced. And whatever they do with it, they can't sort of leave it within the brackets of a museum visit and just go away. And I think this is like the very strong message in terms of strengthening citizenship, whether it's global or local. And I would have some more comments on locality as well. But in terms of that museum and whether museums can support the concept of citizenship, I don't know if they can support global citizenship as a concept. But I think in a way they support the feeling of responsibility. They certainly can, and that very museum certainly does it, in my opinion.
I would like to, yes, please, yes.
I think I'm glad that you took that up, because I think museums are aspirational, and I think cosmopolitanism is aspirational. And so I'm not imagining that actually museums are going to teach people who come in about the legal, historical underpinnings of citizenship. I am asking the question, the extent to which people are learning to engage with difference, whether it be that difference next door or that our shared global problems. So in other words, there are many ways to get to cosmopolitanism. One is, learning about your new neighbor, and that your new neighbor comes from a country, and let me learn about that country. Or another is to do the Swedish method, which is to say there are these shared problems that we all have to take responsibility for. But in no way am I thinking that museums will do the work that schools are supposed to do, or get us all to vote. I am wondering. The book is about how it helps us feel or not connected to communities beyond our own, and whether this is a tool that museums are tools that are underutilized, able to communicate ideas and values, but not necessarily inspire practices. And as I said at the beginning, not, normally falling short of cosmopolitics, basically.
Yeah, I would like to pick on that, especially in this cosmopolitanism, nationalist continuum, because it's quite provoking idea these days, as we know that cosmopolitanism, in a pure sense, it's not the most trendy term or concept nowadays. But in your understanding, is a kind of global sensitivity or something like that, or a promise for tolerance, for a common understanding. I would like to ask Łucja, as a European studies scholar, what do you think about this continuum of nationalism and cosmopolitanism and the place of museum on this continuum?
Well, one thing that I can certainly agree with in terms of what Peggy was speaking about is that we are definitely living in the moment of change of the museums, but not the big museums as we know them, but also smaller local museums. And to answer your question, one of the conclusions of the research that has been done in local Polish museums is that the world, or the globalization in general, is a very distant and a very abstract framework, and it's not really relevant. It doesn't make a lot of sense in general. But at the same time, a lot of museums in Poland are trying to play, and they are actually playing a very important part in in supporting the sense of belonging to the people that live and to the place. So it's like making the sense of the place and making the people feel that they belong to a place that means something. And I've done a number of interviews with local curators and museum custodians and the visitors. And all of them, well, not all of them, but it was very common to use an expression, a very narrative, by the way, expression, that those museums actually make those places being inscribed in history. And history, what I found personally quite surprising, was much closer and much more graspable than the world. At the same time, what we found as a rather surprising fact was that in a number of local museums in mid-sized towns such as Tarnów, for example, in Małopolska, people would tend to think that making their local heritage as well as everyday objects heritage, categorized as heritage, makes them empowered locally. But at the same time, and this is really what we found surprising, was that connects them to the idea of Europe, but not to the idea of the world. So on one hand, we found out that definitely cosmopolitanism has a very bad press locally in Poland. This is something not to mention if you want to be treated, as a friend of a museum. And it's very much connected with a kind of decay of civilization in general, but at the same time, democratization and openness to the everyday heritage is something really, you can experience it on every level in a number of local museums. So cosmopolitanism has a bad press, but somehow the links, not necessarily Europe is okay, but somehow locality is really constructed by the museums.
So actually, and that's a very interesting train of thought. So if you really want to see this playing out right now, take the Museum of the Second World War, simply. So it was very much what you would consider a cosmopolitan project. It was a museum of the Second World War. World War, let us not forget. Now, in fact, as would be expected, and I don't see a problem with it, it has Poland at the center, set within the European theater, and the world aspect is essentially the third form of totalitarianism, which is identified with Japan. Now, from an American perspective, the Second World War starts not with the German invasion of Poland, but with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and the Pacific theater is the Second World War, and the United States comes to Europe very late in the game. So that's the first step. The second has to do with the right-wing government's objections to the Museum of the Second World War, which is that it's, quote, not Polish enough, and that it only shows the bad side of war. Well, you might ask, what's the good side of war? The good side of war is hardens people, makes them more patriotic, makes them more willing to die for their country, makes them more national. So the national cosmopolitan issue is absolutely exemplified in the history and the debates and the conflicts around this current museum right now. But this in Gdańsk. Now, the second very interesting point you made about heritage. One of the things that strikes me in Peggy's book is that actually art museums have pride of place. You deal with other museums for sure, but it's interesting that in the case of Denmark, it's the National Museum, and it's the Museum of World Culture, etc. But when it comes to Qatar, and when it comes to Singapore, and Boston, and New York, they are largely art museums, and their big move is to do what your local museums are doing. What your local museums are doing is they are adding value to ordinary objects by reclassifying them as heritage. Nothing ever starts out as heritage. Heritage is not born. Heritage is a mode of cultural production. Heritage is made, not born. And what's happening in the museums that you describe is that which had been ethnographic is reclassified as art. And that is the way the value is added. And where you can really see this played out, there are two other examples that would be very good for your project. One would be what happened in France with the reorganization of museums there and the creating of the Musée du Quai Branly, which essentially reclassified, what you call First Nations or so-called primitive art as, quote, art. What they did with the Museum of the Colonies, which became a museum of immigration, which is brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And then the Museum of Mediterranean civilizations in Marseille. The whole reconfiguration, the whole reorganization of collections, the whole reorganization of the institutions is perfect for your project. And then the other, of course, is you mentioned Te Papa because Jetta had worked there. But Te Papa is also a brilliant example of a complete integration of collections, reorganization, getting rid of the division between a museum of natural history, which had the Maori and the Pacific Islanders along with the animals and the plants, and then the Museum of Art. and a complete getting rid of that kind of division, getting rid of those kind of, this is not just a matter of exhibition. These are institutional changes, and they are also very linked, and this is something I did miss in your book. They are very, very linked to what I call disciplinary formations in the formation of museum collections, and what happens when those disciplines migrate out of the museum and into the academy and leave behind the material expression of those older disciplines, which is what happens with ethnography, what happens with those kinds of divisions. So, what I can say is I can see the next book.
Well, I think those are very interesting responses. I just want to say that blurring between the art museum and the ethnographic museum is also a move to not have to face how you treat ethnographic materials. So that was part of the global museum assemblage that, around the world, people were very aware of the provenance of these material objects and didn't know what kind of stories to tell, and how can you speak for the other? And so instead of actually trying, one strategy which I found repeatedly was to treat ethnographic materials as art. And so that way you choose the most beautiful object and you showcase it for its aesthetic properties, but you don't have to really face or talk about how it got there, what your country was doing there, and who were the people that made this and what was their experience. So I think it can cut both ways.
In art museums.
Well,
Not necessarily,
but ethnographic museums, I think, are having their own. The alternative is like, what do we do? How could we do ethnographic museums in the year 2017 in the right way?
There are some good examples. But
Right.
that's another conversation.
Okay.
Okay. I'm tempted to ask this question to Barbara because Peggy was telling about the people before I give the floor. But just last question to you, because you brought something in your laptop, in your head, here to Poland as a experience curator with your international experience, organizing, curating exhibition overseas. What were your ideas when you came here to these local conditions, challenging conditions, here to this museum with your idea? What you brought globally, but also what you learned locally?
Wow. Oh, you're a good moderator. That's all I can say. So let's see. Well, I think the first point I'd make is that this is a very, I say international rather than cosmopolitan, but I think it is a very international museum. International in the sense that it is, I like to think of it as a museum of the history of Polish Jews in the nation's capital on a world stage. And this is, I think, great fodder for Peggy to discuss on the continuum. But that's actually how I think about it. And I would say that I actually came with, I love objects. I'm a collector myself. And I came, I think, with some reservations about a multimedia narrative exhibition. I think because the ones I had seen weren't very good. And this actually goes to a point, Peggy, that you made in your talk tonight, where you said about museums that if they don't have the objects in their collection and they can't loan them, or that is to say borrow them, that they can't that they can't tell their story. But of course that's not true. First of all, there are a lot of really, the Bollywood, for example, exhibition, and a lot of the exhibitions at the Museum of World Culture don't necessarily depend on a collection or on objects. So how can I answer? This is a really tough question. All right, I'll put it to you this way. That this was to be a museum of the history of Polish Jews, a history that would be told in the place where the largest Jewish community in the world once lived, that was the epicenter of the genocide of Polish Jews and European Jews, where that history had come to be defined and overshadowed by the genocide, and where, until recently, meaning the last 20 or 30 years, to study Polish Jews, historians in Poland, meant to study Polish-Jewish relations. And the history of Polish-Jewish relations is not a history of Polish Jews. And the opportunity here in this place, that was both the place where this enormous Jewish community lived for 1,000 years continuously, and where they perished, to actually really present a history of Polish Jews in which Jews are agents in their own history and not simply objects on which others project their fantasies and fears. This, for me, was the opportunity. This was the great opportunity. And I would say that that's probably, I don't know whether it's a perspective that's brought to the local situation, because I think that a lot has developed here in the field in the last 20 or 30 years, and that the scholars working in Poland are fluent in Jewish languages, are part of international networks, that, so it's a whole new generation of scholars. But that difference between a history of Polish-Jewish relations, which is generally understood as a history of anti-Semitism, and if not anti-Semitism, assimilation, versus a history of Polish Jews, which is a completely, from our point of view, different story. And that is the story that we really try to tell in this exhibition. So, but that is I've got to really think about that question.
This is the material for your own book.
Yeah, and exactly.
Yes.
So when I don't know the extent to this is true, but I'm wondering how you thought about the various constituencies, not only the audiences for the museum, but also the donors for the museum. So to me, this is, and I might be wrong, is a museum that's very much embedded in this transnational network of interests and concerns, and that a lot of them would have competing interests. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
No, I mean, that's actually a great question. And I would say for the sequel to your book, this would be another good case study. So I would say that when I used to, before the museum was up, and I would be talking about the museum, particularly in North America, to American Jews, it was really, I would say, it was really awful, to be honest. The very fact that they came to the lecture, I thought to myself, if you feel that way, why did you even bother coming? But in any event, the very fact that they would come to hear about this, and the response I got was responses like, why are you making that museum in Poland? And I said, well, where should we make it? They said, Tel Aviv, New York. And of course, can you imagine this museum in Tel Aviv or New York? Would it have anywhere, near the impact that it has here? So I said, well, you don't say that about the Jewish Museum in London, the Jewish Museum in Stockholm, the Jewish Museum in Denmark, the Jewish Museum in Paris, and all those cities have Jewish museums. No, but they said, well, there are no Jews in Poland. I said, well, there may not be the 3,300,000 Jews that were there in 1939, but there are Jews in Poland, but that isn't the point. The point is the power of harnessing the emotional power of the place where the story was told. So that was the first thing. The second was cynicism, skepticism, but actually cynicism. That was the worst. Oh, they said this is a plot by the Polish government to whitewash Polish history and to fleece the tourists, to get those Jewish tourists to come and then get all their money, from the hotels and the this and the that. And I just, honestly, it was painful. Then when I would present the museum here in Poland, the response I would get is, it's going to be a terrible museum. It's going to be horrible for Poland because it's going to be a museum of the history of anti-Semitism, of Polish anti-Semitism, that poisonous phrase. And of course, I thought to myself, of course not. How would I ever be involved in such a project? Of course not. So those fears have dissipated. However, there are competing interests and there are competing perceptions of what the history is. But the most interesting thing is how people walk away, to some degree, confirmed in their understanding of what this history is. And this is something we know about museums. Well, actually, Zahava During did a study of Holocaust museums in the U.S. And what she says is that, generally speaking, people do not leave having learned a lot of, quote, new information, and that generally they leave with a certain amount of confirmation of certain understandings they had when they came. And I know this is very disappointing because we're all about the transformative experience of museums and how they're going to make the global citizens and make us all more cosmopolitan and appreciate diversity and all the rest of it. But actually, empirically, when she did the visitor studies, the outcome was not quite, they didn't quite match the aspirations that are expressed by the museum makers. However, there are some responses that I think go to some degree against her suggestion, and that is, one of the best is when Polish visitors leave and they say, this is a museum of Polish history. That's the best. Because the idea that they would recognize a history of Polish Jews, a museum of the history of Polish Jews, as Polish history, meaning not a history of the nation, not a history of the state, but a history of one of the many groups, that lived in Poland. This, I think, is a tribute to them, and it's a tribute to us as well. And then on the part of Jewish visitors, because they know zero usually, and you think, of course, that they would know something, but in fact, they come usually very well uninformed. They'll say things like, I had no idea. They were here for 1,000 years. This is how they got here. That they created this enormous civilization, this culture, etc. That they weren't all Hasidim. I mean, that it isn't all the Holocaust. So for them, it's this sort of it's like you kind of lifted a veil or opened a window. This sort of feeling of a revelation. So in that way, I would say Zahava's I would say very depressing assessment isn't quite right. But still, anyway, so that would be how I respond.
That's wonderful eye-opener, the place we are here for everyone. The book itself, it's an eye-opener to how we can look at museums and how nations are put on display. I would like to invite you to ask questions to our wonderful panel of tonight. Also the question how you imagine museums, how you would create museums. So let's say also for these creative exercises of tonight. So floor is yours. Please, questions, comments are welcome.
I have one comment, maybe kind of remark. As you said that museums do not have this power of transform from zero to something. I have this feeling that museum as an institution is one of many institutions in a society, so it's a part of something bigger. So it cannot be just the one thing that will transform everything. It's just a kind of educational place that is connected with other educational places. So we can try, but it's not in a it's in a flow with something. So maybe this is the reason. So when somebody come from outside, he may or she may be amazed. Wow, I didn't know about this. But if we are here and with all this history and all this society and this culture, it's like, okay, it's we heard it in a school, in other institutions. So maybe this is the reason why it doesn't have just this power of transformation.
Just a comment to what you were saying. Let me share my fascination with you. That I think that the great change that's happening at the moment in terms of the role that museums are playing is that museums have decided to leave their total monolithic authority for interpretation of the world on one hand, and this is also what this museum is saying. So they say, hey, we also have problems with interpreting things, and the objects from the medieval times don't tell us everything, and it's impossible to reveal all the context, to grasp everything. But the second thing is that the museums are no longer sort of neutral, objective players constituted only to transmit the knowledge, but they want to have their own say. And I think this is also reflected in your book, that that the museums that you are describing are no longer a kind of neutral institutions that say, hey, we have a right to tell you the truth, yeah? But they say, we also we are interpreting, we have some doubts as well. We're in the process of interpretation and we are ready to share it with you visitors, and this is what's happening here as well. But also the point that museums become active agents locally, and they don't want to, they somehow want to leave their signature. And I think this is a great moment of civil change, because of course the case of the World War II museum that you mentioned is one of the examples, but it's not about history. Now it's clear that when museums have their say, it's about the present relation towards the past. It's about us, it's about the present as much as it is about the past. And I think this is really the good part of the cosmopolitan and of the civil part of the what you call cosmopolitanism.
If I may just add something, these local museums, which I would very much agree that they tend to be conservative and very much into supporting and strengthening the local heritage, but very often they have temporary exhibitions, and these temporary exhibitions tend to be much more courageous and open-minded and often in the cosmopolitan spirit. So they often play these two functions. One is, as I said earlier, more conservative, traditional, but at the same time they try to also open new doors through temporary exhibitions.
Hi, I'm Alina Landowska. I'm a PhD candidate in cultural studies, and I would like to ask you actually a few questions, and two. Exactly. First is, what do you actually mean by global citizenship? Because we are using these words, and it can mean a lot of things, and I think it's really worth to explain that. And the second thing is that what was actually said regarding the presence and the not only the past and the history, which is actually presented in the museums, but the presence of the temporary times. And what's happened these days was, in Paris, there Louis Vuitton opened the exhibition of African art, and it's very interesting example what happens there, and what they are trying to show. The African moves every movement and on the continent, and they are trying to explain and give the voice to the African art, but also to the revolutionaries when that's actually take place there. So I would like to ask you, Professor Peggy, about how do you think about that? What will happen next? And is that interesting place for further research regarding the whole cosmopolitanism?
I'm not sure I understood the second question still. I'll start with the first. So as I said, cosmopolitanism for me was an empirical question. It was an empirical question whether, if curators would feel that they were doing this as part of their work, and then what that would mean. And as my research evolved, I realized that it was useful to think of cosmopolitanism as three parts: the idea of ideas and values, the ideas of these skills. So sort of like, how do you engage with people that are different than you? Are you comfortable? What do you say? What does it take to kind of be in different experiences around different people? And then the third part, which is this political project or a vision of the world, and that these don't necessarily come together or in that order. And across the range of museums, it was much easier to do ideas and values, and sort of the skills or the competencies or the sociability, conviviality. There are lots of words you can use for that, which is, and that it could come through these multiple doors. So, as I said before, it might be because you're learning about somebody who just, a group that is now living next door to you, or it might be that you're learning about a group that, how that group is connected across the world, or it might be that you're learning about problems that the whole world is facing. And so that's what I mean. It's tonight we're using cosmopolitanism and global citizenship interchangeably, and the citizenship always gets complicated because people want to focus on that legal aspect of citizenship, or that actual, formal status. And in my mind, I think about lots of cultural citizenship, social citizenship, sort of different kinds of memberships. And ultimately, that's what I'm interested in, a sort of, are different ideas of the nation being presented that are more inclusive, and is this a space, whether it's in a permanent exhibition or a temporary exhibition, where that invitation is being offered to visitors and it's maybe being taken up or not. And I just forgot what I was going to say in relation, so I'll think of it again. But can you say your other question about the Louis Vuitton in Africa?
Yes, this is the exhibition of African artists in Paris. And
it's happening now?
Yes, it's happening now. And it's a very national exhibition, I would say, because all of these artists are expressing the national problems, national conflicts, a lot of ethnicity and ethnic conflict. So I couldn't find anything about the openness and the other things. And this is the voice of national legitimacy, I would say. And the question is if you plan to go to research Africa, because I'm very curious about that.
So are you saying these are French African artists living in Paris who are making?
No, these are African artists presented in Paris.
Okay. Well, I'm not saying, I mean, I don't think all of these discussions are happy and everything's wonderful. I mean, interventions that are challenging are just as important as interventions that kind of like build bridges, right? So in that sense, you can think of the Harlem on My Mind exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum in the 1960s. That was a very charged point. Or that, what's the exhibit that was at the Pompidou Center? That was about the say it again. Those are, that sort of prototypical exhibits that had major power. So, in fact, I am starting to work on a new project that is about canon changing and about how artists and writers from different parts of the world gain global visibility, and how does that challenge the canon, or maybe we need to rethink what we mean by canons to begin with. And I want to compare the artistic world and the literary world. And I am hoping to include Ghana as one of my cases, but here again you have, it's not a national story, it's a regional story. And so it's a regional story within Africa because the cultural field is Nigeria and Ghana and Senegal, and then you have to look at how Africa gets inserted into this cultural hierarchy as opposed to Latin America, as opposed to Asia, both temporally and spatially. So I'll see you in about 10 years.
I work as a guide here in the POLIN Museum, and I would be interested to know if in your research you are also taking this aspect of work, because I feel as guides we are carrying this what the curators have designed the exhibition. At the same time, we have the visitors, and we are attuned also to what they need or to what they are interested in knowing. And there's also our own sensitivity. So I was wondering, has this element also been present in your research? Because that is also part of, very often, there's a certain reflection or a policy of the museum, how to work with guides and, yeah.
Right. So I remembered what I wanted to say, which is about this kind of visitor re-education, in a way, I would say, is one piece of the package that I was talking about, the assemblage that I was talking about, which is like making the curatorial voice more visible. So having on the wall a statement by the curator, I am so-and-so, and I got interested in this, 10 years ago when I was studying this, and here's my picture. Oh, sorry. Here's my picture, and here's my signature, and that means I'm a human being. I'm not, God on high or something. Or a robot. Yeah. So there's sort of, when we talk about engaging the public or making authority and opinions more transparent, that's a way that this is happening around the world. Now, curators and guides are, of course, part of my package here. I spent a lot of time watching tour guides, but I didn't speak with them, a lot of them, in a systematic way. But there were two really interesting papers at the conference that you had here in March about guides at the Jewish Museum in Berlin one paper by a guy named Jackie Feldman, who teaches at Ben-Gurion University and at Yad Vashem. And what I remember about it was, and having just been in Israel, is he talked about how the end of Yad Vashem is like you come out onto this patio and look at the Judean hills, and it's this story of hope, and sort of, again, here's the bricks and mortar communicating something to you. But then the very much regulated message, like how much can docents and guides actually put in their personal ideas, and what are they supposed to say? And so I wish I could be more helpful on that one.
With your soft voice, I'm sure the message is true. Please ask questions, comments.
Yeah, I can. Okay. It's interesting because it seems that you're deconstructing the messages of the museums. For example, the Yad Vashem Museum with the whole story that it says. But when I was listening to your talk, I was thinking about the local museums, the museums that are trying to build local identity. And I was thinking how actually the tools that are used to build either national or global citizenship can be used quite consciously in a constructive way to build local identity. And I was thinking about this example of the Ruhr Museum in Ruhr. And maybe you have a comment on this, so this is this museum of the post-industrial area. Yeah. Where the museum was created because the people who lived there didn't really like the area because it was kind of somehow problematic, and they decided to build a museum to it's very, yes, to revitalize. They also installed universities there, and it all changed, and actually the identity of the people, in a way, emerged. But it's very interesting how all of the tools, pretty much, that you described were used there to completely consciously create the identity of the local people.
Well, I mean, museums remap landscapes, right? And it could be upscaling and downscaling. So I was focusing on scaling up, but you just gave us an example of scaling down to a region, right? And one one small research project I'm doing now is about the Asia Society, which is a private effort. It's a John D. Rockefeller started the Asia Society. It was mostly about economic, fostering economic relations between the United States and Asia. But when you look back at the way that Asia was being defined during these different periods, that museum, that institution, which is mostly about economics and politics, and then has this museum also, is like remapping the world. And when we had the whole discussion about the Asia Pacific Trade Agreement, and they included Peru and that the coast of South America, the Asia Society was like a precursor of that to expand that circum Asia Pacific region. So I think what you're saying is a great example, not just of remapping the cultural landscape, but also encouraging those who live there to reimagine it and re-embrace it in a different way.
Barbara, do you remember it? I don't know which year you came here, but this museum is the example of remapping the local landscape. It was a park here where people were sunbathing. They still are. And they still are. This is the local folklore, yes.
Would you like to relate to the...
No, you take it.
Just one comment, because I think it's really interesting, because the example that you mentioned relates to a very interesting narrative concept of linearity. So, of course, those people had to reinvent themselves, had to reimagine themselves as a new community. And we know that there's a number of interesting theories that we have to imagine ourselves as a group in order to feel that we belong, to feel the identity. What I think is that, of course, you can trace a kind of mythologies that are told in a linear way. So starting from the founding fathers, mothers, the beginning of the world, whatever, and then the story goes. But the interesting part is that there's a new model of time in museums now. And this is also what's happening to some extent here. And this is not a linear story. This is the story, a much more horizontal story. And this is not a story that starts somewhere and necessarily is directed somewhere. Yeah, and this is exactly what's happening here as well. So it's not, the message is not that this is how it had to happen. There was some kind of necessity of fate, history, whatever. But it's not only the question of alternative histories. The question is that we can go in different directions. And there is, of course, we do need linear stories to build a number of local narratives, national narratives. But I think that in terms of global thing, but not only global, there is now what's starting is a new way of narrativity. It's multi-narrativity. Obviously, there's also a clash of discourses in a number of museums. So you actually have a meeting, a clash, an explosion of various narratives. But there is no longer a monopoly of linear narrative, like the proper mythology of inventing traditions from the beginning to some future.
And I think that Peggy's book actually exemplifies that. The examples that you give are very much about that, about the mixtures, the juxtapositions, and the multiple relations, multiple connections. Pardon me. And it's not necessarily that there are multiple narratives, but there are certainly different narratives.
I was just wondering, because you come out of researching migration and you come out of this idea that this interconnectedness has to be somehow reflected in the exhibitions. But then what I would like to ask you, because I didn't have a chance yet to read the book, how much was this interconnectedness reflected also in the way the people who really visited the museums? So would the people who are these international, transnational migrants really do they come to the museums? Can they find themselves there? Because of course there's an aspect you were talking about. There is this ideas of interconnectedness, and you can go in Boston and see the art of the Americas. But would the immigrants, the refugees, people, would they come there and would they find themselves there? Or are these two different narratives? Like, we open up for cosmopolitanism, but we don't open up for the migrant societies, like migrant groups. So probably that is something which becomes problematic in our understanding.
Right. Thank you. Well, as I said, it's not an evaluation study, so I don't have data on visitor responses. But certainly there is a recognition and a concern in Europe and the United States, at least, about bringing a more diverse class and educational profile into museums. There was that discussion in Qatar also about, could we have texts in Urdu for the one day a week when workers have time off. And I think that did happen in Sharjah, but it didn't happen in Qatar. And in fact, there were lots of ways that public space was regulated to sort of keep immigrant workers, male workers out. So, but as I said at the end, I think demography is on the side of forcing museums to let in the new donors and visitors of the future. And I also think that it was interesting to me to see how groups that came with a tradition of museum going and then did well were able to advocate for more visibility of their particular community. And so, and Korea is a great example of that, because the Korean government has been for years actively promoting the insertion of Korean art into world museums. And so there is, inequality being replicated, but then there are also these points of pressure to reorder the hierarchy.
Well, also, I think there's an assumption here that if museums were only better, everybody would go. But actually, there is a culture of going to museums, and it's not shared. And so, for example, there are two examples. One is there was a kind of a wine and food museum in Napa Valley. And they wanted very much that the Mexican farm workers in the region would come. And then what they discovered was that these Mexican farm workers were not comfortable inside these very modern buildings. They felt completely uncomfortable. So what they did is they did all their programming for them outdoors, and they did it in the garden. So that was a very, the kind of sensitivity, it wasn't just a matter of, we'll put more of your things in our exhibition and you will be happy because you will see your things in our exhibition. That doesn't even begin to address the issue. But the second was a couple of museums in Germany have been offering guided tours in Arabic led by refugees for refugees. Because some of these refugees are art historians, museum professionals, archaeologists. And I think that and particularly, they can do it generally, but particularly where there are collections that are related to their own history, that is really a marvelous thing to be able to do. But I'm convinced that there are people that don't come to this museum because they don't go to any museum at all. So museum going isn't an assumption, and there's a class issue, but also it's the nature of the architecture. I think Te Papa, the National Museum of New Zealand, is really interesting in that way because they relocated from a hill to the waterfront. They relocated from neoclassical buildings to a kind of expo architecture. So there were, and a kind of architecture that just said, we are open for business. So, and they did many other things, but the nature of the architecture, the location, they're just, many other aspects that can help to, if you will, and in fact, they said, they had a whole advertising campaign, we're not a museum, we're the not museum, which of course means they're a museum, but or we're not the museum you think. So it was trying to counter the negative view of even people who are museum goers. So I think the issue of getting the audience is, obviously it's complicated. Everything's complicated, so it's not an answer.
Just one more local example, the third one. I think the interesting part is that, in fact, museums as an institution, museums as institutions, are not necessarily good for nomads and nomadic cultures. And in Poland, we have a great, but paradoxically, strange also museum dedicated to the nomads and Roma. It's a Roma museum in Tarnów. And paradoxically, it's located in a manor house. And it makes no sense at all. But the point is that there's a great collection. It's the only and very unique museum that tells the story, but the Roma are not familiar with the concept of history as we know it in terms of, historiography. So what happens is that, museums operate within certain limitations of representation, and it's very challenging to tell the story of the Romas with their categories. For example, if we only want to respect the orality, and then the number of issues arise, like what language is it going to be narrated in? Polish, English, or what? And the greatest pride that comes to the organizers of that museums is that there are some Roma groups that come there with sketchbooks, and there's this great gypsy woman with special earrings, and they go there to sketch the earrings because they know that they are authentic. And then it is, now in the 21st century, it's treated as a sign of real representation. So I think it's great really to look at the dynamics of how we want to represent the dynamic culture on the motion, like of the Roma, with the use of the quite static representation forms that we actually have in our museums.
If you mentioned this local museum, I want to also relate to the museum from the sea shore. We mentioned the Second World War, but it's also a museum of emigration, which is also a kind of phenomenon for this part of Europe, which is also particular. For myself as a migration scholar, I can say that it says only one part of the story, one flip of the coin. It doesn't relate to what Peggy said about what people learn or what people brought to other societies. It's only the museum of documented flows of Polish people wherever they went, a museum of emigration. It doesn't say anything what they, for example, brought back to Poland, which is about the whole idea of bringing ideas, skills, norms, values, and so on. But that's one thing. That's more difficult, apparently, to research, to present, to display. But the other thing is what Polish people brought to the nations they went to. No word about that. So that this is the great idea of this museum, the location of the harbor where Polish people departed in the 19th century, that the biggest transatlantic ships were leaving. There is nothing about the wider sense of this migration. It's only just people went there, they were doing this way, they were bringing these artifacts, they were doing this and that. So I think that this is still some story to tell for this kind of museum, especially when migration, nomadic nation, at the end of the day, every nation is nomadic, or at least has a component of nomadism in itself. Yes, so what Peggy wants to tell us with her book, that there is not enough to document something, yes, to bring artifacts, to show the inside of it, to show what people bring back, what people bring there, what is the story under their skin, not only what they experience themselves. And this is the great example with this Museum of Emigration, which you still need to see next to the Second World War Museum, which will be soon maybe closed. Who knows? Yes? No. Okay, so let's hope for the best. So I would like to thank Peggy for coming here to Warsaw again. I hope this is not the last time, that just a new chapter of your book has opened. We had a great many hours tour in Poland together, discussing things. Great experience, great eye opener from for both of us, I think. So thank you, Barbara, again for this wonderful job you did here. Thank you, Łucja, for coming from Krakow and all the way from Krakow, yes. To Warsaw to share your insights with us, great insights from your research. So thank you to you all for coming this evening to Poland, to think with us, to imagine with us. Yes, maybe you bring back homes new ideas, new stories to tell, new imaginations of your own home museum. Yes, whatever we have, artifacts at home, we collect things at home, so there is always new perspective here. So thank you, Joanna, for organizing the event, the great event we had tonight, which is for, so to say, the end of academic year, because in Poland, although the official date is the end of September, but we know that the classes, courses, programs finish in fall of June and July. So thank you again for having us here, and I wish you all the good evening and enjoy. And thank you again for coming. Thank you.